a particular case from the world of witchcraft. Hello, dear friends. How are you? Welcome. Thank you for joining me here. I'm arithharger, and today I would like to bring to you a particular case from the world of witchcraft. Given the mood of the season, and yet again, historical information for witchcraft studies in terms of, history, not on advice or practice. On advice, I have my own White Wand series, and on practice, who knows, the Black Wand and the Red Wand series in the future. I don't know. That was actually the original idea since before starting the White Wand series, but I wanted to start first with advice and then the practice. But who knows what the future holds. Anyway, let's go into it. While it's not the focus of this video, regardless, I would like to point out that the term witch is a gender-neutral term. This is important to make reference to this, due to the content I shall present part of it in this video. It has become quite common to associate the term witch with the feminine. And one of the most important reasons for that is because, historically, the great majority of people persecuted, charged, arrested, and or executed for practicing witchcraft were indeed women. There were men that have also been persecuted and executed, cocked in the act for witchcraft and sorcery, of course, and other magical endeavors. But those numbers are quite small when compared to the numbers of women persecuted and executed for practicing witchcraft. This led to the erroneous belief that this occurred because it was more common for women to practice witchcraft, and that somehow women are more inclined to such activities than men because of, a lot of very inconsistent misconceptions and inventions concerning the biological makeup of women, as in forceful pseudo-scientific and spiritual reasons to prove that women are more prone to magic in general, which is why they were the main targets of persecution throughout history since at least more or less the 10th century onwards. But that's incorrect, obviously. The reason why women were the main targets persecuted and charged and executed for practicing witchcraft and other forms of magic wasn't because of witchcraft itself or magic itself, but because they were women, regardless of their trade and occupation. It was about misogyny, and not actually because of the practice of magical arts. Charged and executed for witchcraft was, in some cases nowadays still is, the excuse to enhance fear-mongering among the people so that women could lose any economic and social power they held. Throughout history, there were as many men as there have been women to practice magic, and this is well recorded, well documented actually. And even nowadays, among animistic societies, it is like so still, with, of course, a couple of exceptions of some indigenous and animistic societies in which it's actually men that are usually the ones linked to the spiritual. But even in modern times, and as recent as our contemporary time, as recent as the early 20th century, and, focusing on Europe, which is the geographical context I'll be addressing today, men and women were witches, more commonly known, of course, as wise folk or cunning folk. So it's not that women are a lot more special in some way due to something biological, and that's the reason why they were the great majority of victims of religious persecution throughout the Middle Ages and the modern period, and most especially in the modern period, actually, with the rise of Protestantism. It was because they were women, and it was a war on genders and targeting the feminine. This fact can be reversed to just to further state this point with the following example. The great majority of spell books and ancient grimoires have been written by men and not women. Does this mean that men were more prone to magic since there are more evidences of the male recording and practicing magical practices and rituals? Of course not. The reason why most grimoires, black art books, and spell books have been written by men throughout the ages, especially in the Middle Ages and the modern period, it is because the feminine was the target of religious persecution to take away the power women held on Western civilization. A war on women in Europe, since at least the Greeks, and further expanding it and enhancing this war through the early days of Christianity in Rome, when the cult of Isis became the most powerful throughout the Roman Empire and directly threatened the existence and continuation of early Christians, leading to the downfall of the cult of Isis, this goddess, and the downfall of all the feminine cults across the empire and beyond, replacing goddesses and other important feminine entities with Christian mythological figures such as the Virgin Mary, attached to the greater cult of the masculine through the figure of her son and that of God. So, even as recent as the early 20th century, among and between the population that does not hold a position of power or any position within the religious institutions, it was quite common for men and women to be witches, and the term witch was originally a genderless term. The idea of the witch being solely for the feminine was then even further stated through several works of fiction and fantasy, especially in the 20th century, by figures such as Lyman Frank Baum, J.R.R. Tolkien, and J.K. Rowling. But I'm speaking of the English language in terms of witch as a term that was originally a genderless term that progressively became associated with women and women alone, and particularly evil women, most especially evil women, due to all the historical background of religious wars on the feminine. Other languages, such as my own, just as an example, Portuguese, historically speaking, did indeed underline the gender of witch through the terms bruxo and bruxa, masculine and feminine respectively, but it's still the exact same occupation for both. So not a separation through gender of the magical arts, but just terms to refer to a man and a woman who practice witchcraft. By the way, bruxo and bruxa are terms of Celtic origins. One thing is language producing terms to express gender distinctions, another is societal and religious evolution applying terms to one particular gender based on discrimination. Sorry. So, picking on that, let us move into the early 17th century in Scotland, where a famous witch named Isabel Sinclair was executed for practicing witchcraft. She did not have the luck, I think luck can be said in here, to have lived a few decades prior to the 17th century, perhaps a century before that. You see, Isabel Sinclair admitted she had talked with or to fairies as she tried to protect cattle from harm on Hallows End with a sheet and some hair. She confessed to this, and so she was hanged as a witch soon after her trial in 1633. Isabel was doing nothing new thousands of generations had not done before all across Eurasia. Men and women had been doing similar procedures for thousands of years, and for a couple more centuries after, until the 20th century. So cunning or wise folk have been quite common among many communities of human populations. They made cures, gave advice, offered protection to people and to their cattle and property as well, and knew how to curse and how to lift a curse and save communities from the hardships of wild nature. The problem for Isabel Sinclair and for many women was the fact that she was a woman, and as organized religion changed and the fear of witchcraft spread in the 16th and 17th centuries, the practices of the cunning folk became ever more the source of superstitions, blended with the most evil aspects of biblical nature, which societies under the Christian religious authority feared the most. Just to be clear, practices of magic were widely popular and known, especially within a Catholic society. And there are many, many recorded events where priests, Christian priests, either worked alongside cunning folk or advice was given to them by cunning folk on how to cure particular ailments. I don't recall in detail a particular example in Swedish folk magic, but I do remember reading about a case where a Christian priest was advised by a cunning person on using a healer's knife, a magical object of the cunning person I've spoken on a previous video, and the priest using it to cure a particular ailment. There's even an interesting statement which I have noted here for the particular subject I'm addressing here today, that reveals that even in Tudor England, magic was widely practiced to the point that led to a leading cleric, Bishop Hugh Latimer, openly stating in 1552 that, and I quote, "A great many of us, when we be in trouble or sickness or lose anything, we run hither and thither to witches or sorcerers, whom we call wise men." So anyone knew where to find a witch or cunning person to help them with their problems. And just about anyone would make use of such services. All across Europe, this was extremely widely accepted, and in countries such as my own, for instance, who remained Catholic with little religious changes since Christianity took root, it still became quite popular and widely known and accepted to this day, being very common actually for all sorts of people to visit a witch from time to time and ask for some help. This is still done today. Of course, this doesn't mean that during the religious wars, Catholic countries didn't also execute people for practicing witchcraft. But again, the problem wasn't witchcraft, but a war on the feminine and a war on minorities. There's a big difference between the witch trials of Portugal and of Spain, two Catholic countries next to each other. Spain struggled to fix its political power and borders within its own borders until quite late, well into the end of the 15th century, and targeting minorities and other ethnic groups such as the Basques. While Portugal was a country before being officially decreed by the Pope in the mid-12th century, and most of the witch executions almost pass unnoticed because the number was too short and was mostly done by the population and not the church due to fear-mongering. It's quite peculiar. I might speak about this someday. The point is, for many centuries, even after Christianity took root, it was quite common for cunning folk to be a fixed pillar on the foundations of a community, and it was just part of culture and tradition. Cunning folk came from all sorts of all walks of life and lived well within the hearts of their communities. But, of course, the point here, things drastically changed in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and it became increasingly hard to be a cunning person at the risk of being captured as Christian theology became less forgiving. The mentality towards all forms of magic had begun to change ever more rapidly since the 1400s. So the early Christian church called both magic and witchcraft delusions, and that was basically it. But during the Middle Ages, the end of the Middle Ages, clerics turned their attention to witchcraft again. The German churchman Heinrich Hamann saw witches as a real threat to society and to the souls of his congregation. His Maleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, insisted that witchcraft was real and a heresy. And for the next 300 years after that, everything would change. Rame wanted witches hunted down, tortured, if need be, to extract confessions and then put to death. Why it's always a German who just loves the good old genocide? No doubt a boy who couldn't accept and handle a simple no and got upset because no girl wanted to touch his pee-pee. There had been laws against witches who caused harmful spells before this, of course, but now the idea began to take hold that all witches were wrong, regardless of what they were doing. They were increasingly seen as agents of the devil, in league with demons, and taking part in dreadful rituals. So within decades, clerics in southern Germany had started often large-scale witch hunts, which then spread to other countries. This is when we start to have confessions of terrible acts of witchcraft. Under duress and through fear and torture, many confessed darker forms of magic and witchcraft. Sometimes those who admitted to being a witch went on to point the fingers at others. It became uncontrollable. The more witches were caught, the more people pointed at some other witch, and the cycle of torture and death went on. There's a famous example in Essex of Ursula Kemp, who in 1582 was arrested and admitted using witchcraft to kill a child and her own sister-in-law. She then accused others of being witches. Several went on to confess gruesome crimes after their arrests. Confessions were often obtained through torture, of course. And the question remains, I think, were the confessions real, or saying whatever it took to end the pain? And even after death of these people, who truly can tell us if the reports were further exaggerated to shock the public even more and plant the seeds of fear and hatred? So this was the witch craze or witchcraft craze all over Europe. Hysteria around witchcraft began to build across Europe. It got to the point that jobs such as being a midwife became a target for persecution, especially taking the belief that witches used fat from children, especially from babies, to make flying ointments. And in England, a new job was created, the witch finders. These self-appointed justices would visit different villages and towns and, for a set fee, of course, root out supposed witches who were then handed over to courts. Can't say that the church did not create jobs. So the witch hunts across Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries are believed to have led to at least 40,000 documented executions. Documented. Many more are thought to have died while in prison awaiting trial or to have taken their own lives through fear. And by the end of the 18th century, witchcraft began to fade away completely from criminal records due to the Enlightenment. The new era of science came to help to end the mass murders, but at the same time also meant that many of the old practices that had got cunning folk into so much trouble had lost their sway on people, and the arts of the cunning folk were never the same again. And I suppose it was a sort of cruel exchange to continue on living. But is life truly worth living if you are not following what calls to your spirit? Let that one hang in the air, right? But, sorry. Indeed, witches were usually women, and many male witches escaped the witch trials. These women are said to have been usually old, ugly, and with deformities. That witch stereotype still remains in many children's fairy tales, right? Court records show that across Europe, the majority of those tried as witches were women, even though cunning folk were just as likely to be men. However, as the church became more intent on stamping out all forms of heresy, women became the main focus of witch hunts. from the 15th century onwards, women were seen as increasingly vulnerable to the temptations of magic, and especially of the devil. They were viewed as sex-mad, ignorant and stupid by many, and clerics writing on demonology described lust-filled women who were seduced into evil by the devil and took part in unholy orgies. Later, reformers took an equally ignorant and dark view of women. For Martin Luther, women were so weak that they were easily won over by the promises of magic. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, witches were nearly always women, and any man caught in the act were usually seen to have been tempted over to darkness by a wicked woman. But outside the court's records, and as soon as persecutions for witchcraft came to an end, the story is much different. Wise folk, cunning folk all over Europe recorded in local communities their works, rituals, and spells, and it featured men as well as women. So, when people state that witchcraft, magic in general, is for women and women alone, or come up with some inconsistency and misconception that magic is just for women because of some biological trait, what they are doing is simply to perpetuate the church's stereotypes and the very lies that were fabricated to wage a war against women and against the feminine. In the communities outside organized religion, the scenery was very different. In such communities where real witches have existed and still exist, this art obeyed to no gender stereotypes and wasn't bound to any laws dictated by whatever you have between your legs. My dear friends, I do hope this video was useful. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video, and as always, thank you for today. Until we meet again, my dear friends.